The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Since many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the Word have handed them down to us, I too have decided, after investigating everything accurately anew, to write it down in an orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may realize the certainty of the teachings you have received. The Gospel of the Lord. Being that we are now in year C of the 3-year cycle of our readings for Sunday, the vast majority of the Gospel readings will be taken this year from the Gospel according to Luke. And today we hear the very beginning of Luke's Gospel before it skips 3 chapters, skipping the infancy narrative to Jesus' first appearance in Nazareth. And we'll, I believe, read the aftermath of that next week. But today's Gospel begins with the very introduction to the Gospel of Luke, and he is addressing a certain Theophilus. No one is really certain for sure who Theophilus was. Perhaps he was a disciple of Luke that he was writing this gospel for. Obviously, he was writing it for Theophilus. Perhaps he was a rich patron. Or perhaps he was a publisher who would ensure the distribution of this gospel. But be that as it may, we see Luke stating his intentions and his project in putting together this gospel. First of all, he acknowledges that there are other accounts of the life and teaching of Jesus. And he states that he is going to give one himself after giving a thorough, accurate investigation of everything. He doesn't say, however, that everything he says in his gospel is historically accurate, that this is exactly what had happened. But he says he wants to write it down in an orderly sequence that Theophilus may realize the certainty of the teachings. So his goal is to present the teachings in a compelling way after having thoroughly investigated what has been passed down to them about Jesus and his teachings. But basically, the Gospel of Luke begins with a letter to a friend, Theophilus. Perhaps the whole gospel is meant to be in that format, and this is the introductory paragraph. And we see a letter as the same type of format in many other writings in the New Testament. The epistles of Paul, of John, of Peter, James, Jude, the letter to the Hebrews. In fact, in the history of literature, the letters that were passed among Christians in the early decades of the church are considered to be among the earliest forms of Christian literature. Christian literature consists of the letters that were passed over those decades and the first couple of centuries. Letters of the great fathers of the church, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Clement of Alexandria, and so on. And we have in many of these early saints, in the earliest writings of the church, teachings that are expressed in the form of letters. We, even down to today, have historical resources in letters that have been written. Founding fathers of our country. We can get inside their head to look at many of their intentions in forming the founding documents through letters that they wrote to one another. Among the most compelling pieces of historical literature of the United States are the letters passed between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson after the two of them retired from the presidency, who were great political rivals, but in their later years became good friends and passed letters back and forth between the two that has given historians great insights into the minds of these two founding fathers of the United States. Even where Thomas Jefferson is concerned, when his wife passed away a number of years before he became president, he burned all of the letters that he wrote to her, and historians bemoan the loss of that, which would have given greater insight into this man. So letters, in many ways, can become very important historic documents. And we see Luke beginning the gospel in the form of a letter to Theophilus. Even down to today, we enjoy receiving letters every year at Christmas. We like receiving Christmas cards, but perhaps many of us like not just the cards, but letters that people include in those cards. I have a very, very good friend who I always give him a hard time each year, telling him, yes, I just received your annual Christmas epistle to the Galatians. He goes on for 4 pages. And many of them, especially priests, like to give every last detail of what they've done over the last year. I call them epistles to the Galatians or Philippians or Colossians, whatever the city is of that particular year I come up with, because they always begin waxing eloquently on the wonderful feast we are celebrating the birth of Jesus, and then proceed into a 4-page diatribe of everything they did that year that you kind of wish you could have done along with them, but nonetheless, they let you know what they've been up to, and then wish you a Merry Christmas. They can be quite long, but sometimes quite very eloquently written. But we look also down to today and the status of communication that we engage in today, and we realize we've really lost the skill and the artistry of letter writing. Technology and social media has not helped. The ability we have to, as we put it, fire off an email or fire off a text. We can be very impulsive when it comes to putting things in writing. And we in many ways have lost the skill and the art of writing a letter, putting the work into writing a letter to communicate, because it's become too easy and we do it too quickly. We don't even communicate in words as much anymore, but in some cases we communicate in slogans or even initials. I think I know a couple of them. LOL, which means something like little old lady. Another one I see is WTF, which I think means something like where's the fire? Maybe it means something else, but I won't go there. But we really don't use words anymore. And when we look at a lot of the emails and texts, we often see misspellings, hastily done letters. And of course, with verbal text interpretation, there's always a phenomenon called spell correct. And it doesn't always correctly check the spelling. Oftentimes it gives us a word that we didn't intend, and we don't realize it until after we've fired off the text. And then we have to send another text. I meant this word, not that word. But we've become very impulsive rather than thoughtful in the manner in which we communicate, and especially how we communicate in writing. And then, of course, with the reality of the internet, much of what we see put in writing can be very visceral, very cruel, in which we've entered a trend and a pattern where we don't put things in writing when we have something good to say, but we usually put it in writing when we have something negative to say, when we want to complain, rarely when we want to compliment. As one with a YouTube page and a social media channel, I do see that quite a bit, to the point where one really appreciates the good that is written, and we just have to shake our heads in disgust with the visceral negativity that pervades the internet nowadays, of people who simply fire off a comment, an email, or a text while giving very, very little thought to it. We've truly lost the skill and the art of writing letters. Of course, any public figure, priests included, are no strangers to the experience of letters written to them or about them. But if there's one thing I've seen just in 20 years of being a priest, and even knowing of it years before I became a priest, if there's one thing that can be counted on, is you will always get negative letters. Someone doesn't like a homily. Someone doesn't like what you said to them personally, or they don't like something you're doing in the parish. They will always go out of their way to write a negative letter, but very few people will write something positive, either to you, to the pastor, to the bishop. Because more often than not, when people think something is going well, they don't see the need to write. But once they get fired up on something, They'll immediately crank out an email, fire off a letter, send off a text, usually within a day, sometimes within a couple hours of whatever it was they experienced. And that is truly unfortunate, whether one's a public figure or whether one is a private person communicating between friends, or in some cases not so good of friends. It's really interesting, some of the letters that I've seen and I've received, both about me or other priests that I've known. It would really shock you, the kind of visceral things they say about other people or about their own priest. But what always fascinates me is after such a diatribe of the visceral things they say, they're actually still dumb enough to put their name on it. Again, we don't think of what we say or do and then attach our name to it. And I'm not saying I'm in favor of anonymous letters. And loving history the way I do, I've often looked at some of these thinking, my gosh, if we were in the Jacksonian period, the period of Andrew Jackson of our nation's history, you look at some of the things that people do put in letters or texts or emails. If we were at a certain point in history, they could probably be called out for a duel. And considering the age of a lot of these letter writers, they'd probably lose the duel. But perhaps fortunately for them, we're not in that era anymore, and I guess being a priest, it really wouldn't be kosher for us to engage in that kind of practice. But have we ever really thought of how we communicate? And especially when and on what occasions we do? So I would offer a little bit of, pastoral advice in this era in which we have mass communication, but very little thought and care into what we put in writing. First, I would say, proofread, please, when you fire off an email or a text or a comment or even just a regular letter. Please proofread the misspellings and the phraseology that people often use. They don't proofread, they just simply crank it out and send it off. Second, if perhaps you get fired up from a homily or a public speech or something a public person has said, like say you don't like a homily given on Sunday, could you wait until Wednesday before you fire something off? Sleep on it. Let it sit for a while. Reflect upon it. Even I have had people who've told me afterwards, they said, Father, what you said in your homily really, really got me angry. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized what you were trying to say. So give some time. Don't be so impulsive, especially in this time of mass communication where all we need to do is pull out our phones, sit in front of the computer, type something out, and fire off an email that we may regret that we sent later. Give it time, especially if it's something that is brought out of anger. And the third, if you are pleased with the work that someone is doing, whether it be your child's teacher, whether it be a public servant, whether it be a priest, tell them. Perhaps write a letter that expresses your appreciation for the work that they do, knowing that the vast majority of things they receive is something negative and in some cases very insulting and degrading. If you are happy with the work of your pastor or the work of your priest or the work of your child's teacher and so on, tell them. Put it in a letter. Write thoughtfully. Write artistically and eloquently. Put some time into it. Because we have lost the art of writing letters. And we tend to do it more impulsively with the mass communication that we have. But as we see in the examples of Paul's writings, which we heard in our second reading, and as we see in the example of the very beginning of the Gospel of Luke that we hear today, and the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, written to the same Theophilus, both of which were written by Luke, we see that the earliest forms of Christian literature is letter writing. In this time of mass communication in a very secularly encroaching society, let us remaster that as a means of the Christian presence in our world today. Let us pull away from the thoughtless, impulsive nature in which we put things in writing because of mass communication that we see today. But let us express our Christian charity, our Christian thought, our Christian rationality, and hopefully our Christian eloquence by recapturing, renewing, restoring, and making use of the lost art of writing letters.